Hello, everyone. I am sorry for the multiple delays due to circumstances. There was things that had bigger priorities, but uh, I'm delivering this stream as promised, and this is going to be an experiment. Now, I'm not sure how people are going to take me talking about Star Wars novels in a podcast format. I personally would rather do a pre-recorded video on this because whatever things I say, or if I make a mistake, I can edit that out. But considering that the harsh reality which we live, pre-recorded videos just like for the most part just don't do as well in the algorithm these days. Podcasts are usually the format that people prefer watching when it comes to like content in general, whether it's a review, whether it's something related to politics or whatever. Pre-recorded videos just don't do as well in the algorithm. It's just sad. It's just so this is going to be something different. Now, for those of you who have watched my reviews for all these years, who've started it, I started my reviews back in 2015, knows I already talked about the Thrawn trilogy. Shit. Sorry about that. I already talked about the Thrawn trilogy. I already reviewed it. I gave my thoughts about it. But that was years ago. That was when I didn't have as much experience when it came to reviewing. I didn't take notes at all when I read my books. I don't take notes unless I'm going to review a book. I don't do it when if I read, because I read other stuff besides Star Wars, and I don't take notes for those because, well, I'm not going to do a review on it, so there's really no point. But for this occasion, I took a bunch of notes. Originally, I was going to do this in a pre-recorded format, but I decided to do this instead because it's more engaging to the audience, those who want to listen, and those who have any questions. Now, what exactly is the Thrawn trilogy exactly? And of course, I have to talk about the Thrawn trilogy because there's 3 Thrawn trilogies. The one I'm talking about here, for those who primarily read canon Star Wars, I'm referring to the original Thrawn trilogy back in the 1990s, not the Thrawn trilogy that came out back in 2017 to 2019, not the Ascendancy novels that came out a few years ago. What I'm primarily talking about is the original Thrawn trilogy back in the 90s. Those other books will be talked about at a different time. I'm not going to be discussing those books. I'm just discussing the Thrawn trilogy on its own merit. I don't care whether it's canon anymore or whatever ever was canon or not. I don't give a shit because honestly, if I want to actually talk about these stories on its own merit, and next time I'm going to talk about the Ascendancy trilogy when I talk about a Star Wars novel series. So let's begin, actually, when it comes to talking about the original Thrawn trilogy. First off, what is it exactly for those who probably have been living under a rock for the past 30 years? What is it? Well, back in the 1990s, for those who don't know, which I'm just going to say this very quickly because it's a story that a lot of Star Wars fans have heard about at some point. The Thrawn trilogy was basically the closest thing there was to a sequel trilogy back in the 1990s. There's 3 books written by Timothy Zahn. The history of the Thrawn trilogy is interesting, though. If you look at the behind the scenes stuff, a lot of stuff from West End Games, which was published before the Thrawn trilogy, it wasn't like because let's be honest, a lot of Star Wars fans, especially EU fans, act like Timothy Zahn was the first one to really write a Star Wars novel, and that's just not true. or he single-handedly started the expanded universe. No, that goes to the grandfather of the Star Wars EU. That would be Alan Dean Foster. Oh yes, the audiobook for the Thrawn trilogy is amazing. If you cannot read it, that is the way to experience it. But that will be for the end of the video. Now, there's a lot of interesting things about the Thrawn trilogy. It introduced a lot of aspects that would actually be prevalent in future stories in the EU. Like, going back to it many years later, it's like, because I've listened to the audiobook twice before I've read the book again. For all the books, it's amazing just the amount of like politics that's in this story and how well it's presented in here, and actually feels realistic and actually feels real. Because in the real world, you do have political factions that exist through various political parties, though they don't use those in this novel. But you do have opportunists like Brosferia, which is probably one of my most hated Star Wars characters. A good character, mind you, but he's just a character every time he appears in a scene. Every time you just read his lines, you just want to punch the fucker because he's such a fucking asshole. Then again, he's a politician. He's the politician that we would all fucking hate in the real world, and we have seen people like him. He feels realistic. The way that the novel reintroduces Luke, Han, and Leia back, when it was first released, mind you, those who've read it in the 90s, that was the first time they've experienced like these characters since they saw Return of the Jedi. So this was the first time they actually got a chance to see where these characters were at after 8 years of not seeing them again, since the credits rolled at the end of Return of the Jedi. And the way the novels aged up the characters, it felt realistic, and it felt like the characters, at least in my opinion, it felt like a good step. It felt organic. It seemed like, this is who these characters would be at this time. They're in their late 20s. Well, Han is like in his mid to late 30s at this point of this timeline in the EU. So you do have some differences. Luke has a different outlook. Not completely, but he's more mature. He's not as childish or like he is in the original trilogy, and there's been a long enough time between them. And I think the way the author himself, Timothy Zahn, nails the characters' voices, like when you're reading the novel, and I don't do this often when I talk about my reviews of Star Wars books, because I don't bring this up, but I just bring this up because this was one of the few novels that did it. Because before the Thrawn trilogy, which these books I'll have to talk about another day, Brian Daley was like one of the few authors that nailed the characters' voices in the original trilogy. Like when I'm reading the novels, I feel like I'm hearing the actors of Mark Hamill, Harrison Ford, and Carrie Fisher doing their characters. I actually could imagine their voices in my head because how well Timothy Zahn nailed their characters, and Billy D. Williams, Lando. And speaking of Lando, which one thing I really love about the classic EU, I'm going by, what I mean by classic, I'm going by 90s expanded universe. I guess you could consider that the classic era, is how well Timothy Zahn nailed the personal relationships between the characters from the films and expanded upon them, because Luke, Han, Leia, and Lando do feel like a genuine like family. They feel like actual friends. And you can feel that when you read the books. And I think Timothy Zahn did a great job of actually greatly expanding these characters' relationships and giving us aspects of their characters that we just couldn't really focus on in the movies because there's simply not enough time. Because books are a different medium, and what you can do in a book is more difficult to do in a movie because you only have so much freaking time to do it. like since we have 5 years, like Han's former associates, who because he was a smuggler, and I don't know what they're doing with him at this point in the timeline and canon. Don't care, but I have to mention this. There are many of the smugglers just don't really respect Han these days, at least in this novel, because he became respectable. And in the EU, there's nothing worse for a smuggler than becoming respectable, because, well, Han did marry Leia, and they don't trust him. Of course, Luke Skywalker is going through his own troubles. Like at the start of the novel, Obi-Wan appears before him like one last time and says his goodbyes, and which would set up what would become an ongoing storyline for the rest of this era. That Luke Skywalker is not the last of the Jedi, but the first of the new, which, well, I'll talk about that further, assuming this podcast gets a good reception, because I don't know. I know it's not as exciting as my Force Awakens rant's inevitably going to be, because people are going to more tune into that. I'm sorry. I know people are not as interested in me talking about books as they are on film, but to me, the Star Wars expanded universe is far more interesting for me to talk about than the movies. Anyway, I got a little sidetrack here. I haven't talked about the character himself because, the Thrawn trilogy. Who better to talk about in this stream than Thrawn? Now, for those of you who I don't think I really need to talk about Thrawn in canon. For those of you who watched Rebels or read the canon novels, of course, he's the blue skin humanoid character that people would see like on various fan art or covers to various books. Like that, most people, when they think of Thrawn, they just think of some blue skin alien. How do I feel like this book introduced Thrawn, at least Heir to Empire? I think what makes or breaks a character is their introduction. How do you introduce this character to the reader? Because if you don't introduce the character to the reader and you don't do it well, then the readers is not going to simply give a shit. They're not really going to give a fuck about the character if you don't do it right. And the way Thrawn was introduced in the very first chapter of this novel, at least Heir to Empire anyway, I felt it was refreshing, and the way he was introduced was different than how Vader was introduced in A New Hope, where Vader, which it is an iconic scene, don't get me wrong, in the movies, but I'm going by the books here, because books, what I'm really talking about, because it's a lot different how you introduce a character on screen than it is doing it on the page. And it's very important to actually get the reader invested, because if you don't even bother introducing the villain correctly, or whatever your antagonist is going to be, then it's like, okay, who gives a shit about this guy? We learn a basic characteristic about Thrawn, about him studying art, and we see what seems to be a hopeless situation. Thrawn basically destroys the enemy in very quickly, and which you get a taste on what this person is capable of. Yeah, some people may think it's contrived or kind of ridiculous that a person like Thrawn is able to understand a alien culture just based on studying their art. But I felt it was an interesting way to make Thrawn a threat, because he's basically be able to study the psyche of a civilization based on the kind of art that's prevalent in that civilization. Now, Thrawn isn't without his flaws as a person, but I feel like the way he was introduced was great. Also, Guild Pelion. How can I forget about him? Guild Pelion is arguably one of the greatest characters in the expanded universe, and he is a recurring character that would make many appearances throughout the expanded universe and would have one of the best character arcs. A really good character, also introduced in the first chapter. Of course, you have your other villain, which is Julius Sabayoff, which he's not as interesting as Thrawn, in my opinion, because Julius Sabayoff is basically he fills in the Dark Jedi role. So you have that, and he was the first of a clones that we would see in the EU. Interesting enough, originally, though George Lucas vetoed this idea, he was originally going to be a clone of Obi-Wan Kenobi. I'm glad Lucas vetoed that idea because that would have been stupid. It's like, really, a clone? Now, some people may not like this idea with this character because force sensitive clones, depending on how you feel about them, you may love or hate them. I don't mind them as long as there's actual problems, like, because I don't believe the force should be able to be replicated, and if there's actual consequences and they're not really stable as a result, I think it works. Julius Sabayoff is not really that interesting of a character compared to Thrawn and Pelion, but his role in the story is basically to be a foil for Luke, while Thrawn is supposed to be a foil for everybody else. Now, of course, there's other characters that are introduced in the Thrawn trilogy. There's Talon Karrde, which I think is one of the coolest characters in the EU, and he isn't featured that much, unfortunately. I think he's a really unique character. He's like, I didn't really appreciate Talon Karrde until I went through the Thrawn trilogy multiple times and saw him in multiple other stories. I just feel like he introduced a new dimension to the underworld in Star Wars, because the smugglers is not something you really get to see very often. At least until this novel was introduced, like, it had everything, and I'm surprised Timothy Zahn managed to fit so much in over 1,000 pages. If we're counting the whole Thrawn trilogy here, I'm not just talking about the first novel. I'll talk about the entire trilogy. The very fact he fit so much stuff into this like series, it's like, damn. And yes, eventually you would see the underworld be explored in future novels, but I feel like here it added a new dimension, because he basically replaced Jabba the Hutt when he died in Return of the Jedi, because there was a power vacuum, and you know how that goes in Star Wars or any other fictional universe. When a criminal organization collapses, someone is inevitably going to replace them. So yeah, that's basically what happens. Now there's a character that was introduced in this trilogy, though she would be expanded upon in future books, like in this trilogy, would be Mara Jade. Now, if there's another character that's basically famous in the expanded universe, when you look at top 10 best expanded universe characters, or one of the first things that come to mind when it comes to expanded universe characters, there's Kyle Katarn, there's Revan, there's Thrawn, and there's Mara Jade. Of course, who is Mara Jade? Do we solely define her because she's the wife of Luke Skywalker? Well, future wife in this case. Or does she have a lot more to her than that? What makes her so interesting? Why do so many fans love this character? Well, I'm just going to be real with you. When it came to Star Wars, I didn't really care for Leia, actually. I thought she was, compared to Luke, compared to Han, I'm going strictly by the movies here. I thought she was kind of boring compared to them. Like, there really wasn't that much stuff that was really interesting about Leia. And I feel like the stuff that made her interesting, I felt it's because of the EU. The EU just greatly expanded upon this character. And Mara Jade, as soon as she's introduced, there's a lot of intrigue about her. Like, who is this character? What is her connection to Luke Skywalker? Why does she hate him so much? why? It's like, what's the Emperor's hand? Like, this stuff doesn't get revealed right away. You just get piece by piece, which I think is a good thing to do if you're introducing a new and interesting character. When you introduce a character like Mora Jade, you don't introduce all this stuff at once. You do it bit by bit. And I actually thought it was done well. Yeah, she may not have much to do in the first novel in the trilogy. That's true. But again, it's the first novel. Of course, she's not going to have much to do. But as the trilogy progresses, we peel more and more about her character. Like, you know what? She isn't just like some bitchy character. There's a good reason she acts the way she does. Like, she had stability and it was suddenly gone. Well, you could argue that she served an evil fascist empire. I guess you could say that. And she kind of had a romanticization of what that order was like. Of course, it would be greatly expanded upon in future books, but I think the theme of her character is confronting her past and letting it go. And I think the way her arc concluded in the trilogy was done well, despite some people may think like, oh, it's so stupid. Like, oh, she wants to kill Luke, and then they end up getting married. Well, that's not what actually happens. That plot is just set up because for all we know, this could have been the last book. The last command could have been the final book, and we wouldn't know anything more. But it wasn't the last book. Of course, this is kind of a little unorganized. I'm just talking about stuff bit by bit. Now, for ways to experience the Thrawn trilogy, don't read the comic adaptation. For the love of God, if you can't experience the trilogy by reading the novels, the audiobooks is the best way to go as an alternative. And the reason I say that because Mark Thompson, his performance in those books, the way he brings the voices of Luke, Han, and Lando to life, you almost forget that this is not the actors who are doing these characters. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't just read the Thrawn trilogy. If that's your only way, you can do it, because you can easily find it by read the comic adaptation by readcomics.com. But I just think the best way to experience it is just to read the actual novels or the audiobook. That's just my recommendation. I think it's the best version, in my opinion, of the book in general. Because if anyone has ever listened to Star Wars audiobooks, because I've listened to a lot of them, like they have high production values. They have sound effects. They have the score from the film. So it feels like at times you're listening to a movie as you're listening to it. If you can't read like the trilogy, that's the best way to do it. Because I wouldn't recommend the comic adaptation to anyone. I tried to get through the comic adaptation. I just couldn't finish it. Like, the art is mediocre for like a good chunk of it. And the art doesn't actually start getting good until like the final book of the trilogy, The Last Command. And even then, I have issues with the way the comic book adaptation adapted the novels. Personally, I think the comic book adaptation would have been a lot better had you not crammed each book into 6 issues and you just did it in like as many issues that was necessary, because it feels rushed. And I just don't like the way the panels like transition. I just don't like the comic book adaptation in general. I really don't. I'm sorry. I for those of you who've read the comic book adaptation and you probably don't mind it, I just personally like don't care for it. I really just don't. I couldn't get past Heir to Empire. Now, it's an adequate way to experience it if you don't have the ability to read the novel or you don't want to and you're more of a visual person. But I still recommend the audiobook if you can't read the book, at least do that. Now, I'm not done yet because there's other aspects of the Thrawn trilogy I want to discuss. The military science fiction and the aspect of it, because whether we like it or not, Star Wars is science fiction, and the Thrawn trilogy introduced a part of the Star Wars universe that wasn't really explored before in the novels. Because before, we had the Lando Calrissian Adventures, excellent books. I've reviewed those about a year ago. The Han Solo Adventures, which was actually the first books to actually nail the voices of the characters from the original trilogy, even though it was primarily a Han Solo novel series. Brian Daley, like Timothy Zahn would do years later, nailed Han Solo. So I'm not going to give credit to Timothy Zahn, but Timothy Zahn is the second person, well, the third actually, to nail the voices of the characters in his novels. I do think that the Thrawn trilogy as a whole, though, is put too high on a pedestal. They're good books. I think there's some of the best Star Wars stories, but it has everything that you could potentially like in a Star Wars novel. Military science fiction, if that's the part of the Star Wars universe you're into, because the politics and the military aspect of Star Wars I think it actually feels real. It's implausible. The kind of military tactics you see Thrawn use in this book feels actually like it can actually be done. In the Star Wars films, let's just be honest, I don't think they're the greatest when it comes to military strategy or when it comes to military tactics. I'm sorry, but I feel like if you're going to like have military science fiction in a sci-fi series, you got to have something that's somewhat believable. I can't answer that, actually. What's the best Star Wars game? It's a matter of taste, actually, when it comes to that. When it comes to Star Wars games. Of course, this novel would introduce another character of that I think is awesome. General Bill Iblis. Bill Iblis, I think, is a great character, even though he's a minor character that doesn't really play a big role in Star Wars novels. I think he's cool. I think he's one of the coolest minor characters in Star Wars, and that's the one thing I really like about the EU. It takes some of the most minor characters and make them really cool. Admiral Akbar, yeah, he doesn't appear that much in the novel, though. He plays a bigger role in the trilogy that would follow up this one. Which one I'm talking about, though? I'll talk about those stories at a different time, assuming this podcast gets received well and people want me to actually continue my reviews in this format. Sorry, I'm losing I lost my train of thought for a second. Of course, this novel I've already told you it's the birth of Jason and Jaina, which are characters that play a big role in the whole series. The whole series, the whole like expanded universe. They would play a huge role up until Crucible, which that's actually Jaina. Sorry if this is a little disorganized. I'm not experienced talking about or reviewing a book in a podcast format. Again, I'm new to this when it comes to reviewing a novel in a podcast form. I'm used to doing it pre-recorded, but hell, it is what it is. Sorry if it's not as engaging as some of my other streams. It's just I'm just trying something new. Anyway, should I get to my final thoughts? No, actually, there's a few more things I'd like to talk about. At least a few more. Sorry, what is that? Oh, what is that? Sorry. Oh yeah. I think one of the things I will talk about though is Pasting. How I actually haven't brought this up in my reviews, and I'm surprised. I've been reviewing Star Wars books for almost a decade, and I have yet to bring up pasting. How's the pasting for this book? Does this book make you like groan when you read it, or does it make you like not pay attention? How well paced are these books? How well paced is the Thrawn trilogy? I bring this up because books are a commitment. It takes a long time to get through them, and if the pacing for a book is like not so good, it's not going to be as engaging for the reader. Of course, this applies for any book, not just Star Wars. So if I bring this up with any, like, it applies to everything. Like Wheel of Time is like a good example. Like if I were to talk about that series again, God forbid, you probably would hear me complain about the pacing in some of the latter books. But that's beside the point. The Thrawn trilogy. How is the pacing for this trilogy? Is it paced well, or is it slow? Well, I've been giving it a good review up to this point, so you obviously know the answer. Though I will answer the question in the medium that you choose to engage with this story. I personally don't like the way that the comic adaptation is paced. I personally think the novel doesn't sorry, not novel, I'm sorry, habit. Novels don't translate that well into into comic book form. I mean, they could have if he had more issues, but I feel like cramming a over 1,000-page like trilogy into like 18 issues is his like it's rushed. It feels rushed. If you're reading the comic book adaptation, it feels completely rushed if you're reading it in that format, because 18 issues to cover something as epic in scope as the Thrawn trilogy, to me, I just don't care for it. In fact, even though this is divisive, I would recommend reading Dark Empire instead. If you're going to read anything Star Wars comic that takes place after Return of the Jedi, that's what I would recommend. Simply because it was made to be a comic book. The Thrawn trilogy was not meant to be a comic. It was meant to be a novel. And the only reason I'm bringing up the novel and the comic book adaptation because it's necessary and it's good to inform people to which version I recommend. Now, as for the original source material, the novels, and the audiobooks in extension, I'm referring to the unabridged ones, I think the pacing is good. There's not a dull moment. The plot is always progressing at a good pace. It doesn't feel slow. I guess that could be one criticism I could give to well, I'll talk about him in a follow-up video if people like this stream, at least those who are watching it live, or well, not live, well, you know what I mean. God, I'm scattered brain today. If they're watching it after the fact, like let's say they're watching it like after the live version of this podcast is over, tell me what you think, because if you prefer it this way, I'll continue. Now, as you already know, I recommend the novels over the audiobook over the comic book adaptation. Mark Thompson, you cannot go wrong. Now, how to acquire the Thrawn trilogy? Well, luckily, for those of you who care to know, this is probably the easiest Star Wars like novels you could track down. You don't have to like really search that far. They're cheap to purchase if you're looking to like find a cheap copy. You could probably find some cheap copies of the Thrawn trilogy that's used on eBay. You could find a PDF easily on like anywhere on the internet if you're looking to, if you can't afford to buy them, there's that way to get it. There's the audiobook, which I don't know how to get. I can't tell you how to pirate those, Sorry, and yeah, I know that's kind of could have pissed some EU fans off that I'm telling people to pirate if they can't afford it. But if you can't afford it, you can't afford it. And I don't believe anybody should deprive themselves of these books. If they can't like experience it any other way but piracy, then fucking sail the high seas, baby, because there's no way in hell I'm going to tell someone to deprive themselves of this book series because they can't afford it. And luckily, the Thrawn trilogy, in a nutshell, it's not out of print. So that's another thing that goes in its favor. It's probably been reprinted more than any other Star Wars novel, excluding the Han Solo Adventures and Lando Calrissian Adventures. That is, like, it's basically so easy to find. There's like millions of copies you could find all over the internet. You really don't have to get far. Not get far, you don't really have to track them down. The comic book adaptation will be harder to track down, but again, trust me, it isn't worth it. I think the comic book adaptation is not an alternative to the book or the audiobook. Even if you are a visual person, you prefer to look at something like an image as you're reading it, it's not worth it. You're better off listening to the audiobook. Now, my final thoughts of the Thrawn trilogy as of 2023. The Thrawn trilogy, I don't see it as the sequel trilogy. I don't. Don't get me wrong, I love the Thrawn trilogy, and I'm an EU fan, a huge EU fan. Of course, that's pretty obvious for those who have watched me for all these years. Yeah, they do. Well, you're not gonna have it. You're not gonna have any issue looking for them then, though. If you cannot afford them, because if you don't have Audible, then I don't know. I don't know how to tell you how to get the Thrawn trilogy without. You could probably find them easily through a torrent somewhere, though. If you don't want to risk getting a virus, then again, I don't know. You might have to ask somebody else on that one because I don't know. I don't pirate audiobooks. Though if you have Audible and you have the ability to get them on Audible, that's where I would recommend getting them at. Though if you would rather get them for free, which I would recommend that instead, if you have a computer that's able to torrent them, then you could probably torrent every EU book that in existence. Now I got sidetracked again. The Thrawn trilogy, the legacy of these books in general, cannot be understated. The Thrawn trilogy, in general, is some of the most influential Star Wars stories out there. A lot of stuff that we know today from Star Wars, well, it didn't, because, it wasn't just the Thrawn trilogy, because Thrawn trilogy took some stuff from West End Games and other sources that came before the Thrawn trilogy, so I'm not going to give the Thrawn trilogy all the credit, but the Thrawn trilogy did influence many aspects of the Star Wars franchise for decades to come, such as stuff from the video games, like concepts were introduced in the Thrawn trilogy. The military science fiction part of the Star Wars franchise was introduced in the Thrawn trilogy. Sorry, my brain fart. The character of Thrawn would not exist, obviously, without the Thrawn trilogy. So without the Thrawn trilogy, you would not have Thrawn and Rebels. And without the Thrawn trilogy, I don't know where Star Wars would be today. Would there have been a prequel trilogy if there was no Thrawn trilogy? Because there's those out there that downplay the importance of these books, and I cannot say for certain there would be a prequel trilogy. But if there wasn't a prequel trilogy, if there was a prequel trilogy, there would be no Coruscant. At least if we got another planet like Coruscant, it'd be completely different. Also, the legacy of the Thrawn trilogy, of course, this I could probably elaborate more if I ever talk about the Jedi Academy trilogy. You would not have tie-in fiction like we know it today without the Thrawn trilogy, because it gave birth to a multimedia franchise that would spanned for over 20 years. Without the Thrawn trilogy, without the EU that spawned from there, where it had all these books and comics, short stories, and video games connecting with each other, you wouldn't have things like the Halo expanded universe. The Star Trek literary verse after 2001 would not exist. So, like some of the best Star Trek stories that came out in the dark age of Star Trek, where there was no new shows, would not have existed as we know them without Star Wars. Mass Effect would not have had the kind of expanded universe that it has if it weren't for Star Wars. Star Wars paved the way for all this. Multimedia franchises that exist, they would not even give a damn about continuity between books and comics and whatever, because Star Wars did it first. Star Wars did all this stuff first. This interconnectivity between books and comics, all this was done with Star Wars first. And I actually think, in my opinion, the Star Wars expanded universe did it better than any of these properties. The only franchise I think comes close of doing it as well as the old Star Wars expanded universe would probably be Star Trek and Halo. Are the only things that comes close of doing it as well, where it actually feels organic. Okay, Heir to Empire, Dark Force Rise, and The Last Command are the Thrawn trilogy. They're the original Thrawn trilogy, if you care to know. Honestly, I don't know. Audiobooks get taken down all the time for copyright infringement. So you're not like, if you see the audiobooks for the Thrawn trilogy, you're not likely going to get the whole thing. I personally would just, if you have the ability to torrent it, I would try it doing it that way. Though if you can't, then I would just look it up, like liberals and conservatives or neo-Nazis would say. Just said. I know some people, this is not as engaging. I'm aware of that. I'm aware, for those of you who are watching, this is not exciting like my rants tend to be. But it's something that I like doing. I like talking about like books that I've read, and this discussion was interesting. It's unfortunate that if I were able to do a book club with other people, this would be far more engaging than just me talking by myself. If I had 1 or 3 people doing the same thing and just bouncing ideas, because I'm sorry if this is kind of boring having one person talking about the Thrawn trilogy by myself. If I had other people to do it with me, I think it'd be far more engaging, and I'm sorry. I know there's other people out there that probably have a more interesting discussion on this. It's just, I'm just trying to do something different. My verdict on the Thrawn trilogy, though. Do I recommend it? Of course. I recommend it for anyone to read. If they're a Star Wars fan and they are looking to experience the original story that actually introduced Thrawn, or they're just not satisfied with what's currently going on in Star Wars, or they hate the sequel trilogy so much they just want to like erase it from their mind, and you just want to go for an alternative story that basically continues where Return of the Jedi left off. You can't go wrong with the Thrawn trilogy. It could be your first and last expanded universe story. I'll probably do a list in the future for those who want to get into the EU but don't know, like, because there's a lot of material in it. No, I'm not going to deny it. Which expanded universe stories in the post Indoor are essential and which ones are not. If you want me to do that someday, I will do it. Though the way I would do it is I would basically rank them based on how essential are they, and if they aren't essential, are they worth reading despite not being that essential? I mean, that's how I would do it. Oh yeah, it definitely is. Let's see. I don't really got much left to say because honestly, if I'm done talking about the Thrawn trilogy. I'm sorry this is not as exciting, but next time I'm going to suffer through the dumpster that is The Force Awakens. But to top it all off and to make it even worse for myself and to torture myself even more, I'm going to watch A New Hope and Force Awakens back to back. Because if I want to make Force Awakens even shittier and I want to realize how much shittier it is, I have to suffer through the Star Wars film that started it all first. Yeah, it definitely is. Now, as always, my rating system, for those of you who don't know, actually, I need to actually explain the rating system because I don't know if any of you have even watched my reviews, most of you, so I'm going to have to explain my rating system. In fact, before I end this stream, I think it's a good idea that I explain my rating system. The way I do my rating systems is I don't do it based on a number or based on stars. I do it based on like words. Like here's an example. Like the best, like when it comes to things I think are really good, that are so good that I think you should check them out, I call it classic. Classic to me is something that's so good that I consider it to be a classic. This doesn't just apply to Star Wars. Like if it's something it's so good that I consider it classic status. So I'm just going to explain that. Classic status is basically something that's so good that it has stood the test of time or will stand the test of time. So for those of you who want to know what the classic status means, that's what it is. It's the highest rating that I give to any book. Doesn't matter if it's Star Wars or Star Trek or any other novel that I review, classic is the highest. Legendary, I just think it's kind of cliche. I just do classic. Does that make sense for those of you who are watching? That classic is the highest rating? Just comment below if you think it makes sense. Now I'm going to explain the second highest. The second highest rating is masterpiece, which is self-explanatory what masterpiece is. It's a masterpiece, but it's not classic. Does it stand the test of time? Yes, but I don't consider it in the same level of classic as something else. Like masterpiece is something I would probably consider like a good chunk of the Wheel of Time books, but not classic because there's some serious problems with like the pasting when you start getting to book 7 of the Wheel of Time. I would probably like it's Lord of the Rings is classic. That's if you want to know where I would give Lord of the Rings in terms of rating, classic is where Lord of the Rings would go. Good is something that it's a good read, it's enjoyable. It's something I could easily recommend, but it's not in the same level as like masterpiece or classic. It's good, but I don't think it will stand the test of time as much as those stories that I mentioned. Now, the other ratings, I'll just make them quicker just to basically explain them. Okay. Okay to me is like, okay, this novel is not good, it's not bad. You could take it or leave it. That's basically what okay is. Bad, well, yeah, do I really need to explain what a bad book is? It's something that I don't recommend anyone to read. Of course, but what about stuff that's so bad it's good? Would there be a rating for that? I don't know. I have not reviewed something that's so bad it's good. So I'll have to revisit that. Now, the bottom. I used to have fan fiction trash on the very bottom, but I felt like this is kind of demeaning to fan fiction writers who actually go out of their way to make a really good story. So I don't think fan fiction trash is something that I want to use. But what do I use in its place to replace it? But fan fiction trash is basically something that's so bad that it's like, don't ever read it. Don't don't even look at it. Don't even touch it. That's basically what fan fiction trash is. Yeah, like 50 Shades of Grey. But I'm putting that on placeholder for now because I may have to change that because yeah, because I think demeaning people who for writing fan fiction is kind of fucked up. So fan fiction trash is not something I'm going to put on. I'm not going to use anymore. I can use another word for it. Let's just call it literary trash. You know what? Fuck it. Let's call it literary trash. I think that's a better like term than fan fiction trash. Literary trash is it's the same thing essentially as fan fiction trash. So let's just change it. Anyway, that's my rating system. The reason why I have my rating system in this way, it's because it makes it so I have something that makes me stand out when I review books. Of course, nonfiction, I will not even bother with this. For me, my rating is this worth reading or is it not worth reading? There's only two. I don't, but when it comes to fiction, that's what I do. And yeah, it is. Now, what do you think of my rating system? Now, before I end this stream, I'm just going to ask, do you like my rating system? Does that make sense to those who up until this point never understood it? Because I just think it's a way to stand out. Now, I don't know. I should have explained this years ago, but then again, not everyone here watches my reviews of. So it's a good idea that I explain it here because that's so they know what to expect when I do talk about like other books. When I talk about fiction, whether it's Star Wars or not, because I think it's important for those who to know how I do my rating system. In fact, I think I might have to do a separate video in the future so I don't have to refer to this stream every time someone asks me, what's your rating system? Because I think it's a good idea. It's simply because it's unique. It makes it stand out. Of course, will I have a rating? Will I add a rating for something that's so bad it's good? Probably not. I'll probably just put it in bad because I just don't think it's necessary. That's just overly complicated things. Because the reason I just did it, because I just thought it was so boring when someone's like, I give this book a 3 out of 5 stars or 2 out of 5 stars. It's like, why? Why not just do something unique? Yeah, it makes me stand out. Yeah. It's unfortunate that this stream actually it didn't start getting engaging until towards the end. I'm going to have to be a little bit more open in the future. Then again, this is something new. Now, I did have a poll like a few weeks ago if people wanted me to continue my podcast in this style, at least my reviews. I'm considering it, though I'm going to have to see how well my video on the Jedi Academy trilogy, because I'm talking about that in the next podcast if I talk about Legends. Now, I'm going to let people know for the regarding the sequel trilogy before I end this review. I mean, this review is basically over, at least the review portion of the podcast. I'm going to be talking about Dark Empire because I feel like if I'm going to talk about Rise of Skywalker, I have to talk about the source material Rise of Skywalker basically used, because you can't talk about Rise of Skywalker without talking about Dark Empire. So look forward to that. Next week, to end this month, I'm going to be talking about The Force Awakens. That abomination is going to be ripped apart for your entertainment. I'm going to do a 2-hour podcast on that fucking piece of shit movie. And you know what? Even though I enjoy doing this podcast, I feel like if I'm going to actually do something far more engaging, I kind of have to do it with what my audience wants. And I think everyone in the comment section ranting about The Force Awakens for 2 hours, maybe 3. I don't even know if I wait 3 hours ranting about that movie. I don't even know if I could do that. It will be an engaging podcast because I feel like the podcast I enjoy doing the most, besides doing reviews, is I like to engage with people when it comes to doing this shit because it's a lot more fun than just do this. It's like, yeah, this story's good. Yeah, it's good. It's like so amazing. It's like the writing's good. Blah blah blah. It's like the same boring shit. Like, yeah, I have to do what I have to do what I want to. But honestly, if at the end of the day, I have to be an entertainer because this world sucks. It's boring as shit. Yeah, I could talk about books, and I will do that. But I have to be honest with everyone here. It's not as engaging talking about books to my audience as it is ranting about something that people want. Force Awakens. I did it before with the State of Star Wars crew, but considering the fact that, well, we broke off and it's been a long enough time, considering this podcast, the Jedi's Cantina, that it's long overdue to give Force Awakens its freaking tearing it a new asshole. It's far overdue. I mean, I've waited long enough. So, yeah, my stream is pretty much over. May the Force be with you. Stay safe. And do not forget, I'm doing a current event stream on Saturday. And if you need like me to talk about any stories, just give me a link in any video or any post until Saturday and I'll take a look. Anyway, may the Force be with you always.